Constraints are a very common way to have one object control another object. I will go ahead and make my arrow and box curves again. Then I'm going to go up to Constraint and click on this double line to pull this menu out. All of the constraints work in a similar fashion, so I will start by demonstrating the parent constraint, and the rest of them will do similar things. Each of them has a different intent, so the parent constraint constrains both translational and rotational motion. Point constrains translational, orient, rotational. Scale does scale. Aim allows the translation of one object to control the rotation of another object and is commonly used as a look-at kind of effect for eyeballs. Finally, pole vector controls the way that inverse kinematic handles bend. So we'll cover pole vector much later in the semester. We'll mostly stick with parent through aim today. With these, you generally want to run them through the option box. The reason for that is that in the option box, there is a feature called maintain offset. I'm going to move the cube over here, and that means that there is an offset between the cube and the arrow. The cube's pivot point is here, the arrow's pivot point is here. If I keep maintain offset turned off, when I go ahead and I make my constraint, you'll see that the cube is snapped back over to the arrow. I will Control Z to undo that. When I check maintain offset, the cube maintains its position. That's very powerful because it means that I can use this to snap objects together, and it also means that I can use this to keep objects apart. And those are both really cool, really good things to be able to do. Now that I've run the constraint 2 times and you've seen that it has different functions depending on this maintain offset button, let's talk about what the main function of the parent constraint is. Because I selected the arrow curve first, the arrow is going to be in control of the box. If I look here in the outliner, you'll note that they are still in separate hierarchies, but check this out. If I move the arrow, the box will also move. If I rotate the arrow, the box will also rotate. If I scale the arrow, nothing happens to the box. It's pushed further away because of the relative placement of their pivot points, but otherwise it doesn't change size, so it really doesn't scale. That's because the parent constraint, as I said, only does translation and rotation. To see the constraint itself, if I go over here to my outliner, I can open up the box curve, and there is my parent constraint. It lives right here. If I click on the box curve itself, I can see the input of the constraint. I can also see that these channels are blue. They're this light blue color over here. That means that they are being controlled by a constraint that is the blue of constraint motion. In the constraint node here, or if I select it itself, what I have the ability to do is to control the amount of weight that the constraint object has. It's set to 1 by default. If I change it to 0, then the constraint object will have no effect on the cube. And that's also really handy because it means that there are times that this arrow will act as a constraint object, and there are times when it won't. This is also an animatable effect, so I can have the effect of the arrow controlling the cube animated over time, and it can move to follow things. There's a really nice exercise that I do sometimes where I have students use constraints to play a game of Pong. We may not get to that point. Let's see how you all do on this quiz. But because that weight attribute is animatable, you can do some really fun things with constraints. The other nice thing about constraints is that they are a secondary node, which means that if I ever don't like this constraint, I can just delete it. And now there is no more connection between the arrow and the box. Nothing happens. The last thing I'll say while I'm here, let me duplicate this arrow. I'll move it over here, rotate it all fancy so it points the other way. The other thing that I'll say about constraints is that I can have multiples. So if I select both of these arrows and then the box, when I press apply, again, I will see a parent constraint node created on the box because it was the last thing I selected. But now if I look at my constraint information, now I can see that it's got both of these arrow curves. The cube will be stuck halfway between them, which is lovely. And again, if I go back into the weights, I can set 1 to 0. Now the curve will be controlled entirely by this arrow. And if I reverse that and set the weight to 1 here, 0 here, now it will be controlled by the other arrow. With the weights both set to 1, the cube will remain centered between the arrows, and if I set the weight to 0, neither arrow will affect the cube. So constraints are very flexible. You can have a lot of fun with them, and they do a lot of stuff. I will delete this, I will delete my second arrow, and we'll just go through the rest of the constraints and talk very simply about what they do. In each case, I want to select the control object first, the object to be controlled second. So the parent constraint constrained both translational and rotational motion. We've seen that already, so I will go over to the point constraint. The point constraint only affects translational motion. So when I press apply here, you'll see that with the box, only the translate channels turn blue, and now I've got a point constraint. Again, the point constraint appears here. And now when I move the arrow, the box moves, but if I rotate, nothing, and if I scale, nothing. You remember that with the parent constraint, scale did affect the cube just because of the difference between their pivot points, but the point constraint is very specific about what it does, and that can be very useful. So the point constraint only does translation, and it gives you a lot of control. The orient constraint constrains rotational motion. This is a fun one. When I hit apply and I rotate here, you'll see that they each rotate around their own pivot, which is lovely. That's a big difference from the parent constraint. Let me go back and make my parent constraint again. With the parent constraint, I get an orbital motion where the control object allows the object that it is controlling to orbit it. So there are two different types of rotational motion. The orient constraint allows the controlled object to rotate from its own pivot. Very cool. The scale constraint does exactly what you would think. It allows me to take these two objects, and now when I take my control object, its scale will cause the other object to scale, just like the name suggests. The last one that we're going to cover today is the aim constraint. The aim constraint has a lot more options than the other constraints, and that's because it can be used in a variety of circumstances. To keep this simple, I am going to check maintain offset, and now what's going to happen is that as one object moves, the other object will rotate to face the moving object. I think I'll do this the other way, and I will have the cube control the arrow. Hit apply. You'll see that the arrow has these blue rotate channels. When I take the cube and I start to move it, that causes the arrow to rotate to point at the cube. Yes, that is the third type of motion that constraints allow you to do. And it's very cool. And like I said, this is used for eyeballs. There are all kinds of other times when you want something to look at something else, and that's exactly what the aim constraint does. So the constraints are really, really fancy. They make a secondary node that controls any kind of offset or lack of offset information you might need. They have the ability to work at various amounts of weight or influence. And they each perform a unique function, although they are in some cases very similar. So I know that that was a lot of information about what looks like a very small thing. Take some time, try to digest this, get really comfortable with the information, and then move on. Our next type of control will be a little bit more straightforward.